Hello, I want to talk about the Battle of New Orleans. And the reason why is a couple reasons. I get to show off this t-shirt, Battle of New Orleans, a commemorative t-shirt we made for the bicentennial, given to the 99 people who donated to the cause to make the reenactment happen for the 200th anniversary, which I was one of those. But anyway, another reason I saw several YouTube channels that purport to be historical channels, both parroted the typical mistake, saying that the Battle of New Orleans happened after the peace treaty was signed. It didn't matter. It wouldn't have made a difference. It was a waste. Well, that is not true. The battle is very important. It's the battle that saved America, and the United States would not be what it is today. And I will explain, of course. And the reason being is that the Louisiana Purchase was an illegal purchase. It's not how territory becomes a state or territory according to the Constitution. It was a kind of a land grab done by Jefferson, and Napoleon needed money. And really, it didn't belong to Napoleon. The French took over the Spanish Empire. Louisiana at one time belonged to Spain, and they ceded over to France. And in the treaty, saying if the French ever decided not to have it anymore, it would go back to being Spanish territory. So nobody recognized the Louisiana Purchase except the United States and Napoleon France. And of course, shortly after, Napoleon would be out of power after the Battle of Waterloo. Anyway, the War of 1812 was going very badly with the Americans. The United States went into Canada and failed to take anything in Canada. What it did was you riled up the Canadians, and they actually say that they got their identity from saving Canada from the Americans. The British went and occupied Detroit, went into Ohio, and the United States attacked the city of York in Canada, which is Toronto today. And the Crown forces retaliated and killed the soldiers on Christmas Eve of 1813 in Fort Niagara. The British went to Washington, D.C., and burned and sacked the city. They failed to take over Baltimore, which was an important seaport at that time. And because of Fort McHenry, and we know the story of Star Spangled Banner. So the British want to attack from the southern coast. And so, okay, we'll do a pincer movement. Besides attack Washington, D.C., we'll come up the southern route and split the United States in part, take over Louisiana. Those people in Louisiana, they hate the Americans, so gladly fight on the British side. So plan A was for the British to come up Mobile Bay and go overland to New Orleans. And that plan failed due to Andrew Jackson uh, building Fort Boyer at the mouth of Mobile Bay. So I'll talk about that too in a bit. So plan B was go by water and up the canals and attack New Orleans that way, which became the Battle of New Orleans. First, there's the Battle of Lake Borgne, where the British fleet faced the American gunboats. The gunboats were no match for the big British warships. The British made short work of them, captured or killed most of the Americans. Then they came up the canals, or many of the canals could be blocked, except there was one that they were able to get up. Let me do the share screen. Uh, where is it? Okay. Battle of New Orleans. I mean, why it was important. And I'll put some documentaries in the description below. I'm not trying to cover the whole battle. There's some wonderful documentaries, and they're really fun to watch. They involve a lot of the reenactors, people I know. And one was the uh, Battle of New Orleans, a meaningful victory done for the 200th anniversary by the local New Orleans PBS station, WYES. And the other one is the History Channel documentary done about 15 years earlier. The Battle of New Orleans was a decisive victories or decisive battles in American history. And I'll put them in the comments. Both are hour-long documentaries, and cover the battle much better than I did. And another one, a real good few-minute talk on the Battle of Lake Borgne. So check those out. Those are really good. They're actually some of my favorite things. So one the History Channel produced when they used to do historical documentaries. This is one of my favorite. And one part because it has people I know, but enough that. This photograph of Jackson Square in downtown New Orleans, I took that and I think it was 2016 during the anniversary there. The Battle of New Orleans, okay, and I'll tackle the main myth right now. Some people say, oh, the treaty was signed, it didn't matter, it was useless. Well, that's not exactly true. Everybody knew the treaty negotiations were going on, but they were not going to stop. The British general, Edwin Pakenham, Edward Pakenham, he had secret orders saying that, yes, the negotiations are going on, but do not stop. Just signing the treaty and get Belgium does not end the war. What ends the war is afterwards, when the treaties are approved by both governments, the British Parliament and American Congress, and then the copies are exchanged by the ambassadors, and then the war is over, which really didn't end until February or March 1815. So this is a couple months before that. And so it actually did matter if the British had captured New Orleans. It's very likely that they would have not approved the treaty, and then the treaty wouldn't have mattered. But it's one of the most lopsided victories in American history because there was something like 14 Americans killed and a couple dozen injured, compared to several hundred British killed and about 2,000 casualties altogether on the British side. So uh, very one-sided is the American victory the war needed because the Americans were doing very badly. And so the hero of the day, Andrew Jackson, it propelled him into celebrity status and eventually to the presidency. We're not going to talk about that right now. This was the pinnacle of his career. And so, you may hate Andrew Jackson, but there's two places in the country where he's a hero because he is part of big tourist dollars. That's in New Orleans and Nashville, Tennessee, where the Hermitage is. Interesting to note that there are some Seminole War connections, uh, and I'll cover those later. Okay, so the British plan was to go into New Orleans on the left of this map. The red line is the British, and the blue line is the Americans. They come up the canal and then get to the river, and from there it was bottlenecked. They have very narrow land to go over, the river on one side and swamp on the other. Now, what the Americans call the West Bank on the below the river, you may think it's south, but they call it west. The river meanders, and the plan was to attack the American positions there and turn the cannons around and fire on the main American force of Line Jackson. Jackson built several lines, barricades to fight the British. If one would fail, he would fall back. And there's about 3 different lines. And so the British, they had a good plan, but it was too complicated. And that was their doomed to failure. You just had too many people and the timing had to go off right, which it did not. The first part of the Battle of New Orleans, it's not just one battle, it's a whole campaign. Well, the first part, the British ships came up to Lake Borgne, faced the American gunboats, and the gunboats were no match for the British warships. So the second part was on December 23rd, 1814, where Andrew Jackson took the initiative and attacked the British at night. And a night battle back then was very rare because with all the gunpowder and flashes, nobody can see what's going on. It's usually mass confusion. And it was mass confusion at that part. The British were not expecting an attack. And the American attack was actually pretty vicious and stunned the British. And it really set the stage for what was to come. And many of us who've studied and talked about the Battle of New Orleans, the December 23rd battle was actually the more strategically important for what would happen later on. The British backed off, decided to re-examine their plans on what to do. And Andrew Jackson decided that, yes, it was a victory, but it was very costly. And he couldn't sustain a campaign like that. He just didn't have the forces. So the Americans would fight a defensive fight and do the lines or the breastwork. You had Line Jackson on the Rodriguez Canal, which would be where the final battle would end up. First, the British sent out, I think, did a artillery bombardment, and that didn't work. It had no effect. Then they tried an infantry Soiree, and those were two other battles. And finally, on the 8th of January, they decided to do a frontal assault. The first part of that was go the West Bank and take over the American positions, turn them on Jackson, and then do a frontal attack. The problem was the plan being too complicated is that the force that was to take the West Bank got off to a late start. The river current drifted them further down the river, about a mile or so, much further down. It took them a long time to march back up. So their timing was way off. They were not able to start. Finally, the General Pakenham, who was actually the brother-in-law of Duke Wellington, he decided to start the assault. It was a foggy morning. The Americans couldn't see what happened. And part of the British forces here, you can see from the ping, were along the river, and you see in front of us the British attacking a redoubt. And the Americans fought back very hard. The British actually charged over the redoubt, and then the Americans came and pushed them back. So that's one part of the line. They did actually briefly assault and take over. Now, the American officer in charge of that position, his name was Andrew Ross with the 7th Infantry. Seminole War connection here. No fault of his own that the British would attack and, actually do a good job, because these were troops that fought against Napoleon. But Andrew Ross's career in the Army went nowhere, so he eventually resigned, joined the Marines. 20 years later, in the Second Seminole War, he was with the Creek Indian Regiment. There's some Marine officers who are commanding the Creek Regiment. And he's mortally wounded in the Battle of Wahoo Swamp in 1836 and dies at Fort Heilman a couple weeks later. What's significant is he was a Marine captain at that point. He's the first Marine officer to die from injuries in battle in 20 years since the War of 1812. Back to our battle, you see in the middle all those scattered lines. And then in the background, you see trees. That's the swamp where the Choctaw sharpshooters were. And all along Line Jackson, you have the militia, you have the infantry, you have the Baratarian pirates manning some artillery, and you had the local Louisiana militia. And British were going to attack from two sides. Well, that didn't work. Uh, Here along the river, they were kind of pushed back. So they were doing a frontal assault. The problem was is the officer in charge of that one regiment that was supposed to have the ladders to climb over the American earthworks, breastworks. I think that's a 44th Foot Infantry Forces of the British. The commanding officer was totally incompetent, and they get to the American force and realize that they had forgot the ladders and other tools to climb the breast. So they turn around and totally screw up the British plan at that point, bottleneck, and everybody's in mass confusion. Then you see there's a two lines, I guess closer to this end is the 93rd Highlanders, a highly decorated force that still exists today in the British Army. It's only lost one battle, and this is it, the Battle of New Orleans. Their commanding captain, he gave the column orders to halt, which they did, and he was probably going to fix bayonets. But we never knew what was going to be the command because he was killed by grape shot instantly. Uh, and then so the soldiers were so disciplined that they were not going to move without orders as they're getting raked by cannon fire until finally another officer comes up and tells them to withdraw. So it was a horrible battle, is a slaughterhouse. The Americans, of course, killed a staggering amount of the British soldiers. It's what nobody was going to expect. Here's the British side, General Packingham. He was mounted on a horse and I guess it was hit by grape shot. He was knocked off his horse. He wounded, but he ordered to be mounted again. He was immediately mounted on another horse and immediately hit again by fire, and this time mortally wounded and died not long after on the battlefield. I think he's buried in Westminster in London. All the command staff of the British Army was killed in the battle, except the one officer, Major Lambert. He was in charge of the reserve forces in the back. He survived, so he finally decides that it's going nowhere, and so he issues the troops to halt. And so he's really decided to uh, not surrender, but cease fire. And he ordered the troops on the West Bank, which actually could have continued on and pursued and gone into the city of New Orleans. But the British took victory or they took defeat from the jaws of victory, as they say. Jackson, he got the letter from Lambert saying he wants to talk. Jackson says, "Who is this guy?" Not knowing that all the other British officers were killed. And it takes about 2 weeks for the British to eventually evacuate, clean up their wounded, bury their dead. They took some of the dead with them. Some of the soldiers later died and were buried on Mobile Point. We don't know where. There's no remains of where they're buried. This is Mobile Point going into Mobile Bay in Alabama, Mississippi Territory at the time. Actually, don't even know. Yeah, I guess it was Mississippi Territory. State of Alabama didn't come about until 1819. There's a little barrier island at the mouth of the bay, Fort Boyer. In September 1814, the British wanted to come in the bay and take Mobile. They didn't have enough ships. They only had 4 ships. The fort, due to its strategic location, fired on the ships, set one on fire, the Hermes, lost its sail and its rudder, and burned and kept the British out of the bay. So that was an American victory. After the Battle of New Orleans, the British decided to go back to the original plan and take Fort Boyer. At this point, they had dozens of British ships surrounded it, had 5,000 British soldiers at this point who were coming down the peninsula to the fort and were eventually going to put in siege. The American officer, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence, realizes that he's outgunned and the British are soon building up gun platforms on the sand dunes, are actually going to look down into his fort. And he decided that's going to be suicide to get a shootout and surrenders. And that was on February 11th, 1815, 1 month after the final battle at the Battle of New Orleans. And 2 days later, the British get word that the Americans and the British had signed the peace treaty in Ghent, Belgium. And so they stand down. And I think there's one other battle with the British where they burned the American settlement along the St. Mary's River on the border of Georgia and Spanish Florida. So this was actually one of the last battles right here. And so New Orleans has the observation tower. I don't know if they still open it for people to climb up top. It was started in 1840, and they thought for the commemoration, they're going to bring back Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. He just finished his term as president back in March 1837. Anyway, he's been out of office from president for 3 years. They're expecting a big, strong warrior. What they weren't expecting is a frail old man. Jackson's very elderly and frail at this time. He lays the cornerstone, and the tower is partially built, but it's not finished until the 100th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans, about that time in the early 20th century. So just interesting feature on the battlefield. The unique thing about the battlefield is all the different forces, the infantry, the militia, the Choctaws, the Freemen of Color, the French-speaking Creoles, Kentucky and Tennessee militia, Florida Governor Richard Keith Call. He's the fourth and sixth governor of Florida during the Second Seminole War. He originally joined the Tennessee militia and then was in the 44th Infantry by the Battle of New Orleans. And he actually wrote in his diary much about the battle on December 23rd. That's another Seminole War connection. And here we are on the 200th anniversary, myself with Pedro, Seminole tribal member, our friend Mike in Miami. And I'm greeting the general there. Grant Hardin, great guy. He also played Alexander Arbuthnot, the British trading trader, Trader. He was hanged by Andrew Jackson in the First Seminole War for another History Channel documentary. So on that one, he played the British guy. A few of our native allies and militia. Some of you in the reenacting know these guys. I've known them for over 40 years. There. Here it is again, our native allies, some of the Baratarians. It was bitterly cold that weekend, into the 20s and 30s. Here we are again. Great seeing everyone, and I'm wearing a different outfit. This is the British line. Now, the 200th anniversary reenactment had 2,500 reenactors from all over the world. The United States, California, Britain, Canada, Belgium, Switzerland, France. It was a unique international event. This British force is on the field. This is only a small part of them. It was kind of interesting to see the line of the British come across. It's the closest that we've ever had of a reenactment of actual battle. This is, I believe, the Tennessee militia coming out onto the field. This is the British near the end of the battle. The green uniforms are the Riflemen Elite unit in the British forces at that time. And in the background, you see Line Jackson with the artillery and the musketry. Mostly the artillery raked the British line. And this our Soiree, I think is, in one of the famous restaurants in the French Quarter. Was it Andre's? Anyway, this we had a week-long activities going for the bicentennial, so it made it worth it, and is the best event I ever did. International crowd, something going on every day, and okay, that's it. Check out the documentary and the descriptions. Really great Battle of New Orleans with a lot of reenactments and battle scenes. You really enjoy it. And I just wanted to explain that because I love celebrating the Battle of New Orleans every year, 208th anniversary now. So y'all have a great Christmas. And if this is later, you have a great time of year, whatever you're doing. Thank you.